An experimental group is the group in a scientific study that is exposed to the variable being tested. Researchers use this group to investigate the effects of a particular condition, substance or treatment by comparing it to a control group, which does not receive the same variable. The goal is to identify any differences between the two groups to determine whether the variable had an effect. The experimental group is an essential part of the scientific method, which involves forming a hypothesis, conducting experiments, and analysing results. In an experiment, researchers divide participants or subjects into at least two groups, the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group is deliberately subjected to the variable under investigation, such as a new medication, an educational method, or a specific environmental factor. This group's outcomes are compared to those of the control group, which helps researchers isolate the variable's effects. By doing so, they can confirm or reject the hypothesis. For example, if a scientist wants to test whether a new fertilizer improves plant growth, they would divide their plants into two groups. One group, the experimental group, receives the fertilizer, while the other group, the control group, does not. By comparing the growth of the plants in both groups, the scientist can determine whether the fertilizer is effective. Now let's look at some examples. In a medical study, an experimental group might consist of patients receiving a new drug, while the control group receives a placebo. If the experimental group shows significant improvement compared to the control group, it suggests the drug might be effective. In education, researchers may test a new teaching method by applying it to one classroom, the experimental group, while another classroom continues with the traditional method, the control group. By analysing students' performance in both classrooms, researchers can evaluate the effectiveness of the new method. Another example is found in environmental science. To study the impact of pollution on marine life, researchers may expose one group of fish, the experimental group, to water with controlled levels of a pollutant, while another group, the control group, is kept in clean water. The differences in health or behaviour between the two groups provide insights into the pollutant's effects. Now let's look at some strengths of experimental groups. One major strength is their ability to establish cause and effect relationships. By carefully controlling variables, researchers can determine whether the independent variable directly influences the dependent variable. This makes experiments a reliable method for answering scientific questions. Another strength is that experimental groups allow for precise replication of studies. Researchers can document their methods and conditions so others can repeat the experiment to verify the results. This reproducibility is crucial for building confidence in scientific findings. Finally, experimental groups provide measurable and quantifiable data. Researchers can collect numerical data from experiments, making it easier to analyse and draw conclusions using statistical tools. This increases the credibility and reliability of the results. However, experimental groups are not without their weaknesses. One limitation is the potential for confounding variables. If researchers fail to control all other factors besides the independent variable, the results may be skewed. For example, in a study on exercise and weight loss, differences in participants' diets could affect the outcomes, making it harder to determine whether exercise alone caused weight loss. Another weakness is the issue of sample size. If the experimental group is too small, the results may not be representative of the larger population. This reduces the generalizability of the findings, meaning the conclusions may not apply to other groups or settings. Finally, ethical concerns can arise in experiments involving human or animal participants. Researchers must ensure that the experimental group is not exposed to unnecessary risks or harm. For example, testing a new drug might involve side effects, so strict ethical guidelines must be followed to protect participants' well-being.